think when you're dealing with children, you have to remind yourself that even though some of the charges and the crimes that are being committed are the same as in the adult system, they are being committed by people who are children.
That's Veronica Galvan. She is the chief judge of King County's juvenile court, where an alarming number of youth have been facing charges for serious violent crimes, too often involving guns. More young people have been shot and killed so far this year in King County than in all of 2023. I'm Enrique Serna, and welcome to Chino y Chicano. Coming up, we'll talk with Judge Galvan about the rise in juvenile crime and the impact on the juvenile system. This comes as the King County Council voted unanimously August 27th to keep the Juvenile Detention Center open. In 2020, during the racial justice protests, King County Executive Dow Constantine committed to closing the juvenile jail by 2025. That timeline was later moved to 2028, but that isn't likely to happen then either. Here now is my conversation with Judge Veronica Galvan about the challenges facing the juvenile system and our communities as more youth are committing serious violent crimes. King County Superior Court Judge Veronica Galvan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. And you have actually been on the juvenile side for actually a short period of time. So coming into the juvenile side now, what kind of change is that, and how have you adapted to it?
Well, it's very different, actually. It kind of takes me a little bit back to some of the work I used to do before I even went to law school, when I actually worked for DSHS, helping to place young youth into group homes back then. I'm probably dating myself, as it is now DCYF, and it's much different than it was back then. So I kind of find myself going back to some of that social work background, but it is very different in terms of what we're dealing with vis-a-vis the adult system. I think when you're dealing with children, you have to remind yourself that even though some of the charges and the crimes that are being committed are the same as in the adult system, they are being committed by people who are children. And I think there's a very purposeful intent to adultify these youth as if they are like any grown person, and that they're making these decisions non-impulsively and with the maturity and the decision-making skills that you develop presumably as an adult. And
that's not the case at all. It's not.
That is not the case at all. I mean, people are rightfully concerned, I think, about the increase in juvenile crime. But I did watch part of your documentary that you made, 30 years ago?
1995.
And they were concerned about the same things.
Yeah.
The same things.
Right. And I think when I did that documentary for what was then KCTS 9, now it's Cascade PBS, it was interesting because there was really a huge spike at that time in juvenile crime and kids that were committing serious violent crimes, as it's happening now. But the big difference was, I think the juvenile system was completely overwhelmed at that point. I mean, to the point where there weren't enough beds to house the kids. You're suddenly getting these young people committing these types of crimes, because the juvenile system really had been set up more for detention, hadn't it? But like school detention. True.
It was adult light.
Yeah.
It was like our adult jail, but just the kids version. And the thing is these aren't adults, and I think people forget that their needs are different. I've often said, 6 months in a youth's life is like dog years, right? The amount of maturity and changes that can happen in 6 months' time. Raise your hand if any of us is the same as we were when we were 13, right? Or 14 or 15. And you just think about, I think that's why time seems so much slower when you're a kid. Because right now, time for me, I don't know about you, but time for me is going by quicker than ever.
Yes.
And when you're a kid, it seems like you're never going to get there. Like it's going by so slow.
Right.
And I think it's because that's part of that growth process, right? I imagine if for Tree, time goes by very slow.
Right.
As
Well,
it is aging.
there's the brain development, isn't there? And particularly, I think it's even more severe for young males. I have a 35-year-old son, and I would have to say within the last few years where I've really seen some maturity, and even he might agree with all of that. I'm sure he would actually. And but I think that there's a real issue there about brain development and all of that.
We know more than we did 30 years ago. And because we know better, we should be able to ask ourselves to do better. I think right now what we're seeing is really how can we provide rehabilitation and address the underlying causes or the underlying issues that are leading to this behavior? Because we want to nip this behavior in the bud. We don't want these kids to grow into adult behavior of this nature. You know, I don't know anybody, even in the adult world, and I've been a judge over 20 years, that says to themselves, I think when I grow up, I do want to be in jail and I want to be a criminal. I don't think these are the dreams and aspirations of these youth. I think that detention is a tool and it's an important one and we need to have it. I want to be very clear that detention is necessary because sometimes these youth, these families, they just need us, and we need to be able to assess what the issues are, how we can put them in communities safely, and with the services that hopefully address the needs that they have that are leading to criminogenic behavior. That is ultimately our goal, because we want these kids to be safe in community, and we also need the community to be safe from the decisions that these youth are making. And so that's kind of, when we look at it, we know that we're not going to jail these kids for the rest of their lives. We know that. We know that developmentally they need better services and better systems. And I think, frankly, COVID has really done a number on our youth in terms of their mental health. I think social media has done an extraordinary number on our youth in terms of our mental health. I think as a community, we have not reckoned with our own societal and community responsibility within the context of these children. I'll give you an example. As often happens when people disagree with a decision, I am exposed to vitriol, hate, and threats, for having the audacity to release a 12-year-old into community with services. And I think to myself that the adults that are engaging in this behavior obviously are unable to control their own vitriol, their own emotions. They often can't control their own reactions to this degree, and yet they expect the children to do better.
Yeah. And in your case, that actually happened, right?
Yeah.
Just a 12-year-old. Go ahead.
Yeah. It happens. Oh, it happens frequently. It's not limited to one. But yes, it did happen. And mind you, the 12-year-old, knock on wood, is doing well in community. They are going to school. They're doing actually well. They have not committed any new crimes. The case is still pending. They're getting services, and they're thriving right now.
Yeah.
But when we think about it as adults, and we post this hatred, we post this vitriol, we post, anybody who disagrees with us should be shot, should be killed. As an adult, this is the reaction that you're teaching children is an appropriate response to what you don't like.
Right.
As if the world is supposed to conform to your beliefs and your ideas, and as if there are people that you are going to have to agree with 100%. I mean, Enrique, how long have you been married?
I am divorced, but I was married for 20 years. But
20 years. Well, you were married for 20 years.
Yes.
Okay.
So and I'm on good terms with my ex-wife too. So
well, let me. Well, you've had children, right? You have
yes, I have two. I have a 39-year-old who just had twins and also has an almost 3-year-old, making me a very proud grandpa. And and then my 35-year-old son.
And
my daughter.
People you love. Do you agree 100% of the time with them?
Oh, heck no. And they will tell you, oh, hell no, we don't agree with that all the time. In fact, I get a lot of pushback It's interesting because I tell my friends, when the twins were just born recently, and it says, well, didn't you fly down there to San Diego to see him? I go, no, I'm waiting for the go ahead for my daughter because, she will tell me when to step in, when to come down, because I know that she wants to deal with all that and give and control it. So I know I've got to communicate differently with them now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I want us to think within that context, right? The people that we love the most, we don't agree with 100%. No. So I often tell people who say, I disagree with this decision. I'm like, I've been a judge for 22 years. If you can point to 2 decisions that you've disagreed with, I say that's a pretty good track record.
Yeah. Well, I think in all of our lives and how we're dealing with things, it's interesting because I just finished listening to the audiobook of Anthony Fauci, who was the guy that guided us through COVID or tried to very much. Yes. So I think did a great job, faced the wrath of all of these that were right-wing folks. And one of the things that he wrote toward the end of the book was just this whole issue of how we have become this society where this vitriol and hate has been so focused on people that are in public service. And that, and I think really the fact that, death threats that he received, the social media thing, which obviously that's a huge thing because anybody can say what they want to say and they could be anonymous and all of that. So, public service, you got to be tough these days. Let's face it. You know that.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
And I have no qualms with people. I think disagreements are important. I think it's part of the checks and balances that we as public servants understand. It's about why we have transparency. It's why people are welcome to come and watch the work being done and see it in real time. It's the idea that, particularly with people who have absolutely no context or nuance, developing opinions and trying to provide not thought, but literally just verbally vomit whatever they believe to be true.
Right.
Without factual supports, without understanding of some of the complexities around something. In a recent, I think somebody sent me a recent social media post where somebody was upset about a decision I made at this point, like 7 or 8 years ago, and talking about how wrong I was. And I'm like, well, did they follow it up with the fact that the Supreme Court unanimously affirmed me?
Yeah. So, right.
So it's like you miss context, right? Because
right.
of the topic without understanding how our Constitution works. I had somebody once on social media say, how can you keep on talking about equity? And I actually had to point out in the Constitution where it talks about the judiciary as the branch that is tasked with addressing issues of equity. It's in the Constitution that we have to address issues of equity. And you're offended that we talk about it?
I like that term that you just coined there for me, verbally vomit. That's pretty good. Hey, before we go on here, I want to talk a little bit about you and becoming a judge, because your background, you were born here in the state, right? But you grew up in the Yakima Valley?
Grew up in the Yakima Valley. My mom's from Toppenish.
Yeah.
Wapto. Yeah. My grandmother was one of the founders of the Farm Workers Clinic in Toppenish. She was one of the first board members there.
So was my uncle. So was my uncle Tomas. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My aunt used to work for Tomas.
Yeah.
So, So, my family has long-standing roots in the Yakima Valley. My great-grandparents moved there, and my mom was born in Toppenish, and her 12 brothers and sisters were all there too. So, yeah. And then eventually we moved to Pasco, and I graduated from Pasco High School. And then went to Western Washington University for undergrad and University of Washington for law school.
What was the journey into becoming a judge? I know you were appointed as a county judge, right?
Yeah. So I really, one of my mentors when I was young was Deborah Juarez. And I know you know Deborah very well. And she was a pro tem judge when I was a young attorney. And I remember when she was appointed, and just the vitriol and the hate and the questioning of her credentials and
talks
her
about it all
ability.
the time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was chilling as a young Latina, as a young woman of color, to see that. It was also nice to see other women of color in these positions, like, Judith Hightower, having mentors like Judge Hurtado, Mike Hurtado, who was one of my primary mentors and helped me, kind of find an internship when I was, had just given birth to my daughter. And he kind of helped me find a way in, a foot in the door to an internship with the prosecutor's office. I mean, all of these people that surrounded me and were wonderful examples. So when I decided and looked around at all these people doing this work, it had never even crossed my mind until I saw them in these positions. It's hard to be what you can't see. So seeing them
exactly
made me look like, hey, I think I can do that. And sure enough, Judge Hurtado, we used to have night court back in the 90s. We had so many, people talk about crime now. We used to have so many cases. We had night court every single day, 5 days a week in downtown Seattle.
Yeah.
Our average daily population was like 2,600 people in jail a day. That's our average daily population. It was insane. We didn't have electronic home detention back then. And, we're talking, even our juvenile detention population was so high. And you'd have people in there for taking a candy bar. You'd have people in there for truancy. You'd have people in there for these things, right? And that's not the population that we currently have in detention at all. But, going to be a judge, Judge Hurtado said, hey, if you're interested, you can come and pro tem. And so I thought, absolutely, because I figured, the one thing I needed to make sure I had to shore up was the qualifications to do the work.
What is pro tem?
So when judges go on vacation, I'm a substitute judge, just like a substitute teacher.
Just fill in, right? Okay, yeah.
Fill in. And so, I kind of earned my stripes doing that for many years. And then I became an administrative law judge with the state of Washington, doing child support, unemployment cases, kind of benefits type cases. And then I was appointed to Des Moines Municipal Court as a municipal court judge. And then after Des Moines, the governor appointed me to this position. So it's going on 10 years.
And then it was in Des Moines. So it wasn't that you started a Spanish-speaking court?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I would like to take full credit and say it was my idea all along, and that was what I was going to do. But like so many good things, it was kind of accidental. Our interpreter wasn't available. And if you understand, growing up in the Yakima Valley, the one thing I understand is that time is money, particularly to a lot of people who work certain types of jobs. And I knew that the people who were taking time off of work, to come back for another 2 to 3 hours, that's taking food from their table. That's taking, impacting their ability to pay the rent. So instead of saying, well, we don't have an interpreter, I'm like, I speak Spanish. They speak Spanish. We're essentially doing infraction hearings, right? Where they come and explain to me why they were speeding. Let's just do it in Spanish.
Yeah.
And we did it, and it became popular. And people were able to access the court in their own language. And then the city was able to save money on interpreters.
Yeah. And maybe you got some people to become lawyers along the way because they saw someone who was a judge that looked like them, or at least think about, public service in some respects. So how has that then molded you for what you're doing now, particularly the role of juvenile court?
So I've been in situations not unlike some of our kids. I've been in situations where you had a parent who was involved in criminal activity. My father was just as involved. He's passed now, but he was just as involved. He was a felon. He was convicted. So I've seen, some of the issues that these kids have seen. I took very, very different choices, and I had people who surrounded me who really kind of encouraged those choices. So when I see these kids, I see so much potential, so much of this isn't what they have to be. This is not, you don't inherit the decisions of your parents if you can consciously make choices of your own, right? And so many of these youth, some of the saddest cases I see is where a youth sees absolutely nothing for themselves outside of the four corners of a cell or the four corners of the room. They have no dreams, no aspirations, because they don't see themselves anywhere else and have absolutely no way to access that for them. And it's really sad. It's really sad. Again, I think COVID took a significant strain on the mental health of our youth. I mean, already they're not interacting, right, with social media and all these electronics. And I think many of our youth have significant mental health issues that need to be addressed. And we're not addressing them online. We're not addressing them by example. Mental health in many instances is still a very taboo subject. You and I both know that sometimes even culturally, it's a very
totally, yes,
yeah, taboo.
Yeah, well, it is, and as someone who I've battled depression, and Matt Chan, who was my partner on this podcast for many years, or actually my good friend for many years and recently passed away. One of the things that we really tried to focus on was the issue of mental health on the podcast, because we knew in our communities, he being Asian, me being, Latino, that we were terrible about dealing with those things.
Oh, yeah.
And so we have to deal with that to let people know that this isn't a failing. It's an illness. So you got to deal with it. So let's talk about what juvenile crime today. I was going through some statistics, and it's really, it's just very concerning. Came across the Seattle Times article. I'm going to read a little bit about that. And this is an article that came out on August 5th, and talking about firearm deaths. Among the 17 youths under 18 whose lives ended violently in King County so far this year, all but one by gunfire. Juveniles and young adults aged 18 to 25 accounted for more than 40% of the county's 63 homicide victims so far this year. And by comparison, 14 youths were killed by this time last year. A spike in homicides of young people has those in law enforcement, in social science, scratching their heads, especially violent crime, as it is happening here in King County. You're seeing this all the time. And yet, amidst this, too, there was a pledge by King County Executive Dow Constantine about closing the juvenile detention center. He made that in 2020 during the time of the racial protests. Now we know that can't happen. They said they were looking at 2025. Now they're pushing that to 2028. And even the discussion about even if it's possible at all. What do you think?
I think that they should focus on interventions. Detention is a tool. It is not the answer. And with that, I can concur. The detention is not the answer to address the acute needs that so many of this youth have. It's not the answer to address our societal need. Our society, that documentary that you showed, we tried to lock our way out.
That was the theme of it at that time in the legislature.
Yeah, it didn't work. We know that. We know it didn't work. We locked away an entire generation of fathers. We took them out of their communities. We took them away from their families. And now I'm seeing some of those second and third generations as well. It did not, let me be clear, it did not work. So, the definition of insanity is trying to doing the same thing over and thinking that you're going to get a different result. And I hope that collectively we're not insane. That is, I still have that hope after all these years. So detention is needed. We need it because sometimes that's the only way that we can intervene to stop something right now and in the right here. I can tell you that, when I think about youth and what I'd like to see, I like to see that, our detention facility, for example, when we hold them, we can get assessments set up very quickly, within 3 days sometimes. And I'm talking mental health, behavioral health, and substance use assessments, so that we have kind of an idea of the child that we're dealing with. Because we can focus on the crime, but at the end of the day, it's this child and the needs that they have that really kind of control what intervention measures need to be taken. So things like detention and electronic home monitoring, those are tools. Those are tools for us to control physical spacing, for lack of a better word, what they have access to and where they can go. That's what those control. But the underlying issues need to be addressed. And that's where we need those therapeutic interventions. That's where we need community to step in through mentorship, through programming, learning, through employment training, through education. That's where we need family to step in and say, hey, we also need help as a family, and maybe we can work with them to provide that assistance. That's where we have, from the court perspective, our juvenile probation counselors who work to get all of those systems kind of talking to each other and working and trying to help provide for the family as well services that they may need overall, such as family treatment therapy, and access to those things. They then report to the court, this is where we're at, this is what we're seeing, and this is the growth that we're seeing. And then as the case winds its way, because by the time it gets resolved, it could resolve in a myriad of different ways, right? It could go to trial. Remember, many of the children that I'm dealing with have not been convicted of a crime. So they have not been convicted. Everybody wants to throw people in jail, but we still have this idea that we talk about that when you're convicted.
Right.
They wind their ways through, the prosecutor may make a different assessment after they themselves investigate. And not everything that's in the police report is necessarily of evidentiary value. That's another nuance that people don't understand, is what people believe and what can be proven oftentimes live in two different universes. And we, in the courts, operate in a universe of evidence, of standards of proof, and of constitutional limitations.
So what do you say, and maybe you just kind of said some of that, but still there is that element out there that says, lock them up, particularly if you have a teen that has shot another person, and most of the time it tends to be another teen. And you have young people showing up, as they did recently, with guns at a parade in the Chinatown International District. Or you have other incidents that have been happening that have become very high profile because they're reported in the news. And well, also we know that there's a spike in gun violence right now. What do you say to those that say, hey, got to lock them up? Lock them up. They committed a crime.
Until when? How long? What would satisfy you? Again, you're not going to lock a child up for the rest of their lives. That's not how this country works. We have, sometimes you have situations where the maximum penalty is going to be 30 days. So do you want to lock them up for 30 days and send them back out with no potential to receive services, no understanding of the behavioral needs, no understanding of their mental health needs, no understanding if the family needs some support, no understanding whether they have access to community programming or community resources, and you want to put them back in that same situation and yet again expect a different result? Or do we want to try and see if we can, when we bring them back in 30 days, they're doing better, they're on track to do better, they're healthier, they're in school. The secondary portion of that is, where are these children getting these guns? We as a society are the only society who's got these kids running around at ages 12 and 13 with full-blown weapons.
And that are,
so those are
weapons that can be manipulated to become powerful weapons that the military uses often.
Absolutely. And that's us. That's us. That's a community. The community, whether through glorification of these things, the idolatry of this, of weapons, the idea that, again, you can settle everything with violence, that's us. As a collective, when we start pointing the fingers at these kids, like they said, you start pointing one finger, there's four pointing right back at you, right? You have to be very cognizant about how we got here. And I don't think people want to think that hard, because that's hard work. It's hard work to admit and be accountable for those things. None of the systems, none of us have clean hands within this context, because these children are accessing these weapons from adults. They're not going into stores and buying them. No. From adults who may not be responsible and have them locked up or have them safely to the side. I mean, we see grown people, get upset that somebody cut them off in a vehicle and start shooting. Grown people. And yet we have a higher standard and expectation for a 12-year-old. It's like putting a 2-year-old behind the wheel of a car and expecting that they're not going to hit anything. We have to take responsibility somewhat that we have created an environment in which these weapons are glorified. They are considered something of a thing to have, to be cool or whatever. But this is on us as well. These children did not come into this world, with a machine gun in their hand. And so we have to significantly, I think, talk about that. And then the third thing I'm going to say is, you talk about high profile cases. And that's great. I understand the interest in these cases. Nobody ever talks about the aftermath. Nobody ever talks about that kid who did one of these things and had a high profile case and is now graduating and is on his way to college and they're on their way, and that this was a lesson learned. This was part of their life, but it doesn't get to define the rest of it. Nobody ever talks about the success stories. Nobody ever talks about the kids who did come back, who moved on, who did, great work. My colleagues, and I'll share this because he's been very public about it. I have a colleague, David Keenan, who was in juvenile court himself as a respondent, and now he's a judge. Yeah. Nobody talks about those folks, and I think I approached this, and perhaps because of the people that surrounded me, perhaps because, like many, I have family, friends who've had these kinds of issues crop up in their family. There, but for the grace of God go I. That there were forks, certain roads where, I took the one less traveled by, as Frost would say, and that has made the difference. So I would love to see people also highly profile the kids that don't come back, the kids that succeed, the programs where those kids did well. The statistics show that in terms of recidivism, you have a very small group of youth that recidivate. And we as judicial officers, we don't have crystal balls, but we're trying to use the knowledge and experience that we've gained through our years of doing this work to try to say, how can we balance this, right? How can we help these youth find their footing so they can be contributing members of society and do better and be better? How can we as a system do better and be better? How do we hold ourselves accountable to that as well? And that's hard work. It's hard work.
Well, I'd love to meet some of those kids and put them on the podcast, probably not kids now, but at least knowing. Yeah, no, I'm serious. I think that's an important message to be heard, and one that we don't usually tell because we are focused on what's now.
And I did a trial once where these two defendants were found not guilty of a very, very serious crime. They had been, 2 years earlier, they had been accused of the crime and arraigned, and they were released on bail. And the outcry was the hue and cry of how dare they release these two people out on bail. I didn't see a single article about the fact that these two individuals were found not guilty by a jury. So it'd be interesting, to just take a little sample of some of these very high profile things and ask yourself, once they were released, what happened then? Now, if somebody gets released and goes and commits another crime, that is blown up and magnified.
Yeah, it is. It is.
It is. But nobody talks about the others, and they get lost in the shuffle because it's not as exciting, I guess. It's not as exciting to hear, that Bob is now married and he's, got a wife and 2 kids of his own, and there's a white picket fence, and he's an electrician or whatever. It's not as exciting.
I want to come back to this issue of basically eliminating juvenile detention in King County, and whether that can be done by 2028. I think at this
no. Let me answer that quickly. No, it cannot. It cannot.
But is it something to aspire to, or is that unrealistic?
I think it would require essentially ending juvenile crime completely. So if you had all the money in the world and you could cite homes or with individual rooms and individual staff that had psychiatrists, social workers, detention staff that address the needs of these youth, and that these homes were safe and secure, and the treatment was individualized, that would be ideal. I mean, certainly sign people up, but realistically and pragmatically, you tell me when there's going to be a time when, to that degree, you're going to invest in these individual needs. They're not. We have to beg, plead to get programming in detention. You recall back in the 70s, they thought it was a good idea to get rid of the mental health system. Remember? Mm-hmm. What happened?
A mess.
Okay, let's talk about a more recent thing. Recently, DCYF said that they weren't going to take youth because they were overcrowded, right?
Right.
6 years ago, we knew because of brain development that they were going to have a new population of folks, right? That they were going to now have people up to potentially the age of 25 instead of 21. Today, 6 years later, they haven't even built a facility to address some of these things. We should always aspire to do better. But we should always at least fund the kids that we have now in a way that we can provide all those services you say you want to provide them. Let's provide them right now. Why are we letting these kids get lost in that shuffle? You want to close down detention and build houses in different neighborhoods to hold these youth in a different way? Great. But don't let the youth that we have here suffer while those decisions are waiting. If you're committed to funding them, fund them now.
So as a King County executive, I don't know, how do you put it? Out of line or wrong in even coming up with that?
I think you'll have to ask him, but I think that he obviously believes that, but I want to say, myself, my staff, we're doing the work on the ground. We see parents come in asking us, can you just hold it for 2 days so I can get something set up, so I can make sure that my other children are safe. We have youth who are currently accused of some pretty significant violent criminal behavior. Those youth also need, while they're waiting, while they're in a holding pattern, they need resources. They need psychological support. They need programming. They need education. They need all of those things. So if you truly want to make some changes down the road, let's start now by funding the programs that these youth need. Let's commit to that now. You can commit to that without closing the detention center and continue to work towards a better idea of what detention looks like. But essentially, we've lost juvenile probation counselors over the last few years. We're 8 understaffed right now. And our juvenile probation counselors continue to do the work, but obviously we're getting increases in the kinds of needs that some of these children have. Their needs are more acute. They're more significant. We're not holding kids here for taking a candy bar from Safeway. Let me be very clear. This is not the 90s. We have the lowest detention population per capita in the entire country because of the programs that my team engages in. Our juvenile probation counselors works with people in community. And they use, those folks to provide community interventions. They work with the therapeutic community, use those folks to provide therapeutic interventions. They work with families and try to get the families on board. Sometimes we can't. And that's a challenge as well. Sometimes I have children who have no family available to them. That's a challenge as well.
And
it's not going to happen.
Yeah. And one of the big challenges you face is that you're really a short-term situation. You're not really set up to be holding these kids for long-term.
We are not set up. When I talk about, we have no, DHAT does not have a programming budget. Some of the programs that they've done through the grace of people volunteering to come into this center to do some of these programs. Right now, because of the complexity of some of the cases, some of these kids are staying a lot longer than we expected them to. Because, for example, somebody charged with murder, we have 15 youth right now charged with adult matters. I think 13 of them are homicides. So when you have some of these complex kind of situations with evidentiary issues, mental health assessments, expert services, these youth stay a little bit longer, and we need to provide resources and programming while they're here. They should at least be provided as much of an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to be better. Because again, they are not going to be locked up for the rest of their lives. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
Because they're minors. And
Correct.
For people to understand that, you can move until what, 21, 18, 21?
In adult court, you can sentence them to longer. But even then, do you want somebody coming out at age, 40, 45, if they get sentenced to an extended period of time with no skill set, no understanding of how they got there, no growth, no conscious effort to engage in bettering themselves? You're not just doing it for the youth, you're doing it for the community, right? Because the community benefits when these youth are engaged. The community benefits from their skills. There's some of these kids that are so talented. And I look at them, and I've told a couple kids, talent, that'll get you to the starting line, but discipline gets you to the finish. What is the lesson that you've learned? What are you going to do to be better, to become better and to do better? And so that's hard work. And that's what the people on my team, every single day, they're doing this work. They're incredible. They're social workers. They're people who understand these kids, who talk to their families. They do the daily in and out, working with these children every day. And to have people say that your services are neither desired nor required, and your work, it has no value, and I think is an insult to them, frankly. And to the work that they're putting in every day to try to help these youth.
So in 1995, when I did that documentary, many of the services that are available now were not around, or probably hadn't even been thought of. At that time, their kids downstairs were being held in the old facility were sleeping on old mattresses because there were so many kids. much has changed since then. Even the number of kids that are being held in detention has decreased a lot. So you know of the changes, and I've seen the changes coming back in looking at what happens there. Um, it gets in a perfect world, or somewhat, or what would you like to see going ahead here that you think could really make a difference?
I would like us to understand that some of the youth that we are detaining are some of the ones who have the highest needs, because there's not a way to put them in community safely at this time where they're safe and the community's safe. So I would love to see that while they're here, that time being used to help them be better versions of themselves, help them grow, understanding that there's going to be consequences for the actions if they're found ultimately guilty or if they're convicted, but that the time that they're here is utilized to the best of our ability to provide them the best opportunity to be a better version of themselves. That's what I would like to see. That if you truly believe that we can provide all of the stuff that you say we want to provide, let's start by doing it now. Let's give them what they need. And if people are claiming that this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to stand up these houses, the cost, by the way, I'm sure you can imagine, of standing up individual housing units across a county is going to be monumental. So if you're willing to do that, if you're committed to doing that, let's start here. Let's start with what we have. And let's fund it appropriately and make sure that these children have the resources that they need. Let's make sure we continue to fund community groups that provide programming to these youth, mentorship to these youth, help these youth with things like tutoring, again, employment training, things like that. Give them a reason to look in a different direction other than the one that they've been going down.
Yeah. How does this affect you? Because I've been in those courtrooms. It's been a while, but I mean, hearing these stories and seeing these young people, and it's heartbreaking, infuriating at times, but also heartbreaking because they're kids. Not to say that they don't deserve punishment, but they're kids.
Yeah. It is. It constantly has me questioning what can we do better? I said this the other day. I said I didn't go to law school. My hopes and dreams were not, gee, I want to lock up kids when I grow up. That was not on that list. The difficulties of seeing these youth struggling, families struggling, and understanding that oftentimes this very system that I work in, the systems that we've created, have really exacerbated some of these issues. So dealing with that as well, I think it's sad. It's my heart is broken almost on a daily basis, but there's also room to hope. Just like kids come before me initially with all of these issues, sometimes when they're leaving juvenile court jurisdiction, I've seen it here. And, I had a kid say, well, my 2 years of probation are now up. I just got accepted to culinary school. And being able to say, you know what, when you get that James Beard Award or that Michelin star, you let me know because I'll come watch. Or me being able to tell a kid, if you make that football team, if you get that D1 scholarship, I'll come watch a game. Me telling them, yes, you can do this. I see you there. I need you to see yourself there. I mean, that's how that impacts me. And it really makes me think. The ironies of especially adults, engaging in certain behaviors, uh, angry about these children engaging in these behaviors, but then it's like you're a full grown adult and you can't control yourself.
Yeah.
Just sit down with that, stew in that for a little bit. I hope that these children learn to think critically. I hope, and this is why I think journalism is so important, and I think that these stories and these talks are so important.
They are.
A lot of the stuff that we do is very contextualized. It's very nuanced because we have a lot of things that are weighing in on those decisions. My heart may go out to people in an incredible manner, but the law and the Constitution may bind how I have to decide something. And those are, we have to put that also on that pedestal that it belongs, because it is the law. And in order for the rule of law to work, we have to let that legitimacy by following it as judicial officers. Despite how we feel about it, we still have to follow it. So you can hold space that you may not, necessarily like something that you're deciding, but decide it anyway, because you also hold that respect for the work that you do in the rule of law ultimately. But these are, again, very, we don't have time to go in depth on each and every case. So oftentimes what people see is what's at the surface. And, there's that picture of the iceberg where you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, because 90% of the iceberg is underwater. And people see these children, and it works in the adult world too. The people that I see often in situations where they've done the worst thing that they've ever done in their lives. And this worst thing will now impact them for the rest of their lives, one way or another. But it is not who they are for the rest of their lives. We have to hold space that they were people before that they did this incident, and they're going to be people afterwards. The question is what kind of people do we want them to be, and how can we help them be that person?
As we close things out here, I'd like you to give you your final word, if you'd like to say to people out there, just about the issues that we're facing today, as we've discussed here, but particularly when it comes to the juveniles and gun violence, and I guess maybe our responsibility.
I just want to say, remember the children are watching. Remember the children are watching. When you post vitriol, when you espouse vitriol, when you espouse hate, and when you espouse the idea that everything can be resolved through violence, the children are watching. These are learned behaviors. And I know a lot of people are like, well, I'm going to insulate my children from that. You can't insulate your children from the world completely, right? They're going to have moments where there's a little bit of trauma in their lives, things that are unexpected. I think sometimes the secret is to in trauma so that they build some resilience and understand that the world isn't, going to conform to their needs like at home sometimes. And that's okay, that you can agree to disagree, but you don't have to. That doesn't mean that you can't still agree on other things or be friends. I think I've said this before. The reason I came into this work, I do think that justice is the greatest vehicle for peace. I think it's the greatest invention of humankind. It's an invention that if we utilize fully, fairly, and consistently, and legitimately, that it provides a way for us to resolve disputes peacefully. We are teaching our children not to think about how to resolve those peacefully through our own actions, through our own knee-jerk reactions, instead of approaching things with some thought, some curiosity, with some wonder, with some nuance, and with a willingness to think that maybe somebody who thinks differently than me is still okay. And that's what I would like to see. I would like to see us be more engaging from that perspective, which for me, again, I think journalists have an extraordinary responsibility within that. They are indeed that fourth stool, that fourth estate, right?
Yeah.
Because you bring sunshine into the work that every government branch does, but you also, so you hold us accountable, but there's also some accountability that you have to bring and educate and teach. And I think in so many ways, we want to be entertained more than we want to be educated. And I would hope that we embrace knowledge. And I'm not talking about, you have to go to college, you can go to your local library. That's what they're there for. But that curiosity to learn about things before speaking on them, I would definitely welcome that.
King County Superior Court Judge Veronica Galvan was also the Chief Judge of King County Juvenile Court. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it. And, well, I hope we find some better angels to help us get there. How about that?
I hope so too. And I have to say, we have a lot of those angels working at this courthouse.
Yeah.
And if anybody's interested in how this courthouse works, this court is open. We come on in, see for yourself.
All right. Thanks, Judge. I
All right.
really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Enrique.
All right.
Take care.
The Chino y Chicano podcast is available on your favorite podcast provider.
You can watch the video version on YouTube, and Converge Media, a leading producer of culturally relevant content in the Pacific Northwest. We'll talk more later.